Hi, this is Paul. This last week, Friday, on the Bridges Meeting Discord server, we did atheist questions only. And so I asked Christians to hold back and just let atheists do their questions. A number of the atheists who came on had been raised Christian. And part of what this channel has grown, from whom this channel has grown, have been a lot of Christians who are sort of teetering on the edge, post-Christians who have given up on Christianity, Christians who have changed denominations, people who weren't raised Christians at all. Part of why I'm glad I have a large record of conversations with people who watch my channel instead of a whole lot of conversations with famous people is because it gives me a better sense of what's going on in the culture, at least the little eddies and backwaters of the culture that I tend to stream in. And when I think about where a lot of this line between belief and unbelief lies and where the conversation is going now, a lot of it seems to swirl around the question, is God's saving power available to me? Now, in the wake of an atheist-only week on the question and answer in the Bridges of Meaning Discord, that might seem strange because belief in a God is a lot of what this sort of focuses around in our culture. And on a lot of my other videos, I've talked a lot about that. Why is it important, for example, with Jordan Peterson, that everybody wanted to ask him, do you believe in God? And he would refuse to answer the question. I don't know that we'll agree on what believe means, and I don't know that we'll agree on what we mean by God. And then I made a video a couple of weeks ago, was Jordan Peterson's meaning strategy insufficient to save himself? And a lot of people did to me what I've done to so many, which I really enjoyed. Well, what do you mean by saved? Because Jordan Peterson's, when this came through and that taped, part of me is glad that the article went so badly, because what that did was release the recording of that conversation between the reporter and Jordan and Michaela. And that was so full of revelation in and of itself. I'm so glad it came out to the world, because in a way it gave Jordan and Michaela a chance to tell their own stories. But I think it really demonstrated Jordan and Michaela's good faith and goodwill towards that reporter, which wound up being undeserving. But as I was riffing off the Rebel Wisdom video, which is what that video of mine deals with, well, should Jordan have gotten, if taking responsibility for your life is such a powerful thing, why isn't it more powerful than benzos or SSRIs? And it's exactly these kinds of comparisons that Christianity and the church has been wrestling with, because we'd have to ask the question, is God's saving power available to me when it seems to be medical technology that is making all the difference? And that's exactly what will lead to, well, no, church is okay, but church is a private thing. Church is an emotional thing. But when I get sick, I really should go to the doctor. And hey, I'm there too. If someone gets sick and they're in my congregation, I'll ask, have you seen the doctor? Have you talked to the doctor? And so often they'll come to me and want prayer with me because, well, it's medical technology has failed them. And so now we're going to look to God, and then maybe travel up north to Redding, California, to the very famous Bethel Church where they're doing all the healing, or go on. I saw a video the other day of Benny Hinn doing Zoom healings, and I just had to smile. But for many, whether it's healing or a difficult thing in their life, or God's hiddenness or unresponsiveness, or the just plain failure of prayer to work and to save, that leads people, well, why would I believe in that if it doesn't work? Well, that's sort of, and some people got a little, well, Jordan, in fact, said, I loved the comments to that video, and I part of the reason I read the comments is because you all are so helpful to me. I mean, and not just positive comments either. I grow much more from the negative comments than I do from the positive comments often. Jordan managed to write a book in that whole business. Well, that's more than I can say for myself. It's a pretty impressive thing. And so, yeah, in some ways his bearing down because he's responsible to his family and his fans, so he didn't succumb to the despair and the temptation to just give up in the midst of everything that he was suffering. Do we constitute that as saved? Fair enough. And, it's really remarkable and a welcome sight to see Jordan being his own self again in interviews with people. And we'll see how strong he gets and how much he can do and where this all goes. But this is, these are the questions that people boil down to in their lives. And I don't mean famous people way on top of a hierarchy. I mean regular people who have to deal with cancer and marital failure and bankruptcy and car accidents and growing old and all of the things that happens. Is God's saving power available to save me? To save me from what? To save me from old age, to save me from death, to save me from bankruptcy, to save me from cancer or heart disease or mental illness. And it's right there in that struggle that we see people, take sides. And you'll find people who write down all of the answers to prayer in church and bring it out to the pastor and say, see, God answers prayer. And you'll find others that said, hey, I prayed a prayer and nobody answered. So these questions are real and they're powerful and they're very, very difficult. I know many spiritual people who gave up on the church and passed it by because they believed they found something better that works for them, some other God or some other practice or some other community or some other something that works, that saves. But this business about God and meaning and story is not so easily put off just because you bowed your head and asked that your mother would live. This is C.S. Lewis's story, of course. Little 6-year-old boy and his mother is dying and God doesn't save his mother. So enough of you, little C.S. Lewis says, and goes off to become an angry atheist, only, of course, to come back. Is God's saving power available to me? What do I mean by believe in God? What do I mean by, it really means is God's power available? And even this, the fool says in his heart, there is no God. And any competent biblical interpreter would say, we're not really talking about an atheist per se. And Alex Ryrie, Glenn Scribner pointed me to a bunch of his videos, and I really have to figure out a way to get them into the mix too, because he tracks atheism going way back, and it's a really good video series. So, but there's so many videos that are competing to colonize me right now that that's hierarchies bind and blind. So I want to get into a bunch of different things in this question, and in some ways the first stop is Tom Holland, because Tom Holland, sort of like Jordan Peterson, is one of these figures that is transparently and honestly wrestling with the pertinent issues. Now, again, I don't think I handled my conversation with Tom Holland particularly well. Someone pointed that out in a recent comment, and I thought, yeah, touche. But one of the big takeaways from that conversation for me was, Tom's openness and transparency, and it was quite a surprise to me that he barely knew who Jordan Peterson was, which I found fascinating because I very much see them on parallel tracks. And parallel, so they're coming at it from different places. Of course, Tom Holland coming at it, well, I'll let him tell his story.
Hasn't come to the fore.
Yeah.
You're a Christian?
I wrote Dominion basically because I lost my faith quite early and essentially became a convert to the Greek gods, probably when I was about 8. And essentially, over the past 20 years, while writing about particularly the pre-Christian world of Greece and Rome, I came to feel more and more that morally and ethically I was, in fact, incredibly Christian. And that's really what I wanted to explore in it, was the degree to which, almost and almost paradoxically in a way, that that the loss of faith in God is itself expressed kind of in Christian terms, that the absence that you have is shaped by Christianity, and that if that...
Now, right there, that's a very interesting observation. The loss in God is shaped by Christianity. And, we're dealing, we're getting higher and higher resolution here, and we're dealing with, okay, what do we mean by believe in God? And Tom really wrestles with this. And I think, again, he's one of the better people. When I talk to a lot of randos, like I do, and a lot of ordinary people, and what I feel in my own consciousness Congress, these are the issues that we're dealing with. And so this is the strange aspect in which Judaism and Christianity are in some ways irreligious or anti-religious as compared to sort of common religiosity and pagan. And there's always this dynamic in Christianity, one way or another, that, okay, now it's certainly, it's nothing atheistic about Jesus' claim to be God. Yet there's some undermining that the Hebrew prophets do, and that Jesus himself does in terms of ancient practices of religiosity. So you get with Jesus both saying things like to his adversaries, well, if you knew Moses, you'd recognize me. And at the same time saying, it's not what you put into your mouth that makes you unclean. Jesus is walking this line that is extremely hard to sort of tease out. And we're continuing to work on this now 2,000 years later.
In Christian terms, that the absence that you have is shaped by Christianity, and that if that lack of belief in God is transmuted into something in which you, as a positive, then, Richard Dawkins is always described as kind of an evangelical atheist, and evangelism is, euangelion, it's good news. That's what Paul and the apostles preached, and Dawkins essentially is in that sense, he is an evangelist. He's saying that if you topple idols, if you purge yourself of superstition, if you come out of the darkness into the light, then you will gain salvation, you will gain redemption. And this is a message that clearly, Dawkins seems to me very Protestant figure. This is very much in the mainstream of Protestantism, but Protestantism in turn is part of the broader Christian tradition, which goes back to, you get these same ideas in the way that the missionaries in the early medieval period are going into the dripping forests of Saxony to spread the word. And ultimately it goes back to the Hebrew prophets and their condemnation of the idols of Babylon and Egypt as stock and stone.
But you're not quite a Dawkins figure here.
No, I'm not a Dawkins figure. So
are you as you celebrate Christmas this year, do you do so in a believing Christian?
Right. So I came to realize basically that my atheism was a kind of subsection of Christianity, that it kind of related to Christianity, perhaps in the way that a thrush relates to the dinosaurs of the Mesozoic.
That's really clever. I mean, the dripping forests of Saxony. He's such a good writer, but then I listen to these in preparation for these videos. I listen to these things often 3, 4, 5, 6 times, and each time you listen to them, more things come out. And I want to emphasize that is, what he just says here.
Christianity, that it kind of related to Christianity, perhaps in the way that a thrush relates to the dinosaurs of the Mesozoic.
Relates to his.
That is Christianity. So I came to realize basically that my atheism was a kind of subsection of Christianity, that it kind of related to Christianity, perhaps in the way that a thrush relates to the dinosaurs of the Mesozoic.
His atheism relates to Christianity the way a thrush relates to the dinosaurs of the Mesozoic. But now what's interesting is in the section before this, he's talking about the pandemic, and he's talking about the the weak need. I don't want to pick on the Anglicans too bad here, but the weak need. Although I know a lot of Anglicans that'll say, "Yeah, you go after those Anglicans for me." The weak need church in the face of this pandemic, and Tom Holland just desiring a dinosaur, desiring the real thing, and that came out fairly soon after I started doing my videos because. Of course, when I started doing my videos, Peterson was sort of new on the scene, and people were trying to get a sense of who he is and what was going on with him. And it seemed to matter to people that I was, a real kind of Christian, more of a dinosaur Christian, rather than the thrushes and the finches and the blue jays that you see sort of inhabiting a lot of the mainline churches. And so just that little turn that Tom makes there, I think, again, that's why he's such a potent figure in this. Why do I do these videos like I do? These people out in public are in some ways a little ahead and representing and sort of demonstrating what I'm seeing again in all of the randos conversations and in private and in regular people's lives out there in the world.
That it's part of a kind of evolutionary continuum. And I guess that my experience of writing Dominion and reflecting on it, thinking about it over the years since, is that I've basically come to realize that all the things that I believe in, so human rights, the essential equality of human beings, the fact that there is a nobility in being human, that these are beliefs. It requires a leap of faith to believe in them. There's nothing kind of scientific or objective about any of these beliefs.
Okay, there's nothing scientific or objective about any of these beliefs. And this is what we're going to get to in this video because you know what I do. I've done it to Peterson. I'm doing it to Holland. Once I sort of get a bead on one of these people who are pursuing this stuff with enough determination to get real and to get serious about these questions, I'm going to keep my eye on them and I'm going to do a deep dive. And so we're going to get into Tom Holland's podcast and some of what he says about Arthur and Jesus, and because he's voicing what's in the culture, but of course, and this was, I think, part of what went wrong in terms of my conversation with Holland, and I still have to learn how to, part of the reason I don't do a lot of high-profile talks is because, at least if I'm talking to randos, they already have a sense of who I am, and so then I can spend the first half hour getting a sense of who they are, and at that time, maybe we can find each other to have a better quality conversation. Whereas when you're talking to high status people, we're dealing with so much projection that it takes a long time to sort of work through the projection and try and get at who they are and what they're really thinking. But Tom Holland so nicely there simply recaptures the dominant, prominent public posture of secularity, that we have this natural, supernatural divide, this objective, subjective divide, all of these assumptions. Now, again, all of these assumptions are going away. And so it's interesting that it's sort of in these classical liberals, these modernists, that we're finding enough of that dinosaur nature, so they're ardently sticking to it, but yet still the transformation is happening within them. They might not be fully conscious of it, but and of course where Tom goes in this conversation is, I think, where a lot of people are and where a lot of people are going.
That these are beliefs. It requires a leap of faith to believe in them. There's nothing kind of scientific or objective about any of these beliefs. And that I believe them because they stand in a line of inheritance from the Christian myth, which is ultimately a Jewish myth, that God created men and women equally in his own image, and that therefore human beings possess a particular dignity. And essentially, my feeling is that if I'm going to believe in human dignity, then I might as well go full blown and believe the whole, all the stories. And I believe in it as a myth. I don't really believe in God. I find it, if I think of it in those terms, if I sit down and think, do I believe, there's a God? And I think of the icy immensities of space, and I think of the icy immensities of time, I find it very difficult. But if I think, Christmas and Easter basically are the times where I do really believe it, because I can believe in it as a story. I can believe in it as a kind of poem, I suppose. And I realise that that in a sense I'm culturally attuned to read it and believe in it if I operate on the level of the story, if that makes sense. It's kind of complex to explain, but that's why I think that in a sense, dwelling on do you believe in God, or do you think this, or do you think that, kind of misses the point, because I think the whole way through the 2,000 years of Christianity, actually it's kind of replicated itself as memes, if you want to put it in those terms.
Memes versus genes. Who said that? Oh, so I'm talking a little bit later. I'm going to have to, I usually do these videos in one sitting, and this one I'm not going to have time just because I've got some people in the church that can't handle PCs because they're senior citizens, and so I set up a bunch of PCs in different rooms so that they can safely Zoom and have Bible study. I'm hosting Bible study at my church and with different senior citizens in front of PCs, and so I have to set up those PCs and get them all going. So I have to keep an ear attending to them. But what he just said there, right there, memes versus genes. That's what Cale Zeldin had said, and I'm having my conversation with Cale and Brett a little bit later this morning. Right there, memes versus genes, and so here basically Holland says, I'm so steeped in the memes, I can't live into the meme. I can't get rid of the memes, and people are just in denial about the memes, and so I have to live into the story. But when you say believe in God like that, well, no. But okay, so what are the two pictures in his mind? Because they're both in his mind. I can't believe in a God, and I think I don't know. I think that's very much, I can't believe in a God as a thing in the world. And that's right. And again, back to how many other videos? Well, God isn't a thing in the world. So what are we talking about when we're doing this? I want to play that again.
That it's the whole culturally attuned to read it and believe in it if I operate on the level of the story, if that makes sense. It's kind of complex to explain, but that's why I think that in a sense, dwelling on do you believe in God, or do you think this, or do you think that, kind of misses the point, because I think the whole way through the 2,000 years of Christianity, actually it's kind of replicated itself as memes, if you want to put it in those terms, that it's the stories that have been the key to its success, that even now in a kind of a Europe where fewer and fewer people are going to church or even have any particular familiarity with Bible stories, nevertheless they have an incredibly potent ability to change the way that that history operates. So why did Angela Merkel let in 1 million people into Germany who were not Christian, who were not, who were from a very different cultural background? And I'm sure that the reason for that is the kind of the heft that the parable of the Good Samaritan has in the makeup of Merkel's Protestantism. I'm sure that the openness of people to refugees in Christian societies is crucially influenced by people's reflections on the Christmas story. The idea of Mary and Joseph having no room at the inn, and I think that.
So there's almost a kind of victory whether or not you believe it. You're sort of Christian with.
What kind of victory, though? What kind of victory? Well, it's a mental victory. It's a meme victory. It's a story victory. And I would imagine, I don't know who this interviewer is, but I mean, what Tom just laid out in front of him is in some ways, again, it's not exactly what Jordan has been doing, but in many ways it's parallel and analogous. And
at the inn, and I think that
so there's almost a kind of victory whether or not you believe it. You're sort of Christian whether you want to be or not, and it sounds like you're sort of
I think that
bowing to it.
It's a question of whether you go with the grain of these stories, and I find actually that going with the grain of them it makes me happier. I feel kind of more stable in what I believe by doing that, and actually it's kind of more. It's more poetic, it's more beautiful. In a way, it's kind of more exciting to believe in things that are grounded in these kind of stories and in this sense of
dare we say it's more meaningful.
Poetry, in a way, it's kind of more exciting to believe in things that are grounded in these kind of stories and in this sense of poetry and
he's re-enchanted his world. He's escaped his meaning crisis.
Of kind of theological grandeur and mythology than it is just to believe in a set of abstract principles.
So this Christmas, this is my last question for you, Tom. This Christmas, after such a weird year, and it's going to be a weird Christmas.
Now he talks about some personal things. That's as much as this video that I wanted to play. And I think Tom perfectly articulates where a growing number of people that I'm talking to are at. It makes him happier. It gives him meaning. But there's a lament and a longing because this question, did it really happen? Now that did it really happen question has everything to do with the initial question we talked about. Is God's saving power available to me? I might enjoy the stories I read in the Bible of God parting the clouds and coming down and, taking on the Philistines and God through David knocking down Goliath. And, that's what we're looking for. But poetry, yeah, I love poetry, but we're all sort of, but that is in some ways the faith of the thrush, not the power of the T-Rex. And well, it's sort of the basement dweller's dilemma that they can be a boss on Fortnite or World of Warcraft, but out in the book out in the real world they're an incel, and so it affords a sense of everyday meaning. But there's an atheist lament or sadness, like the boy who says, "I want to be a real Jedi," or "I really want to live in Harry Potter's world." And, so when you get into Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris's talk, and again, I think that first Vancouver talk was really important. So this is where the physical resurrection of Jesus sort of weighs in with the almost certainly not question.
You look at, there's a lot of languages. Lots of languages. Look at how different they are. It's like, at some levels of analysis, they're fundamentally different. And at other levels of analysis, they're fundamentally the same, which is how we know that they're languages. And you could say, well, there's a very large number of stories. It's like, yes, there are. But the fact that there's enough commonality across the class of stories, the set of all possible stories, so that we can identify what constitutes a story. And I would say that there's enough commonality across the set of all possible good stories that we can say, well, here's a canonical good story, which is, by the way, what you do at the beginning of the moral landscape. Because you say, this is horrible, this is good. We should move from what's horrible to what's good. Say, yes, you've taken a fragment of the universal story and you've made it the axiom of your moral system, which is what you should do. But the claim that I think is not helpful, even though I understand it, is that that's purely a claim of unmediated fact. It's like, no, there is no unmediated fact.
And again, now to go back to Tom Holland, I'm living into the story. It's the memes, not the genes. It's basically what Peterson calls Harris on here is the switch. You're like fact. And then story, the story is fact. Now, someone, I've been pointing a lot to George Marsden's Fundamentalism in American Culture, and one of you, or at least some of you, have started reading that book, and you're starting to see how Sam Harris is a descendant of certain kinds of fundamentalist Christians, and it's exactly in this, because basically you had the modernist fundamentalist fight, and the modernist says, oh, it's by facts. Now that we have the world of object, now we have all these facts, now we can get a handle on the world. And the fundamentalists watch what's happening and like, no, we're losing the plot. We're losing a plot. Let's take the Bible and say, okay, here's the book full of facts. Let's take all of these facts and use them as facts. And that's exactly the move that Peterson calls Harris on doing right there.
There is, yes, even facts aren't unmediated facts. I mean, you can't judge something to be factual without presupposing the validity of certain intuitions, like that causes precede events, or causes precede their effects, and those intuitions could be wrong. I mean, we could live in a teleological universe where everything is getting pulled into the future by some kind of attractor, right? And our notion of,
which is essentially Christian eschatology. I as a preacher, I couldn't articulate Christian eschatology better than he just did there. The strange thing in Christianity is that thing in the future that's pulling history through is in fact the resurrection of Jesus Christ, which happens in the middle, which is why in the New Testament they keep talking about the latter days and the last times and all of that, because of course if you read N.T. Wright on this, the resurrection's supposed to happen, the general resurrection's supposed to happen at the end of time, and here Jesus is raised in the middle of time, and that then sets up, well, you have the present age and the age to come. That sets up this weird now and not yet dynamic in Christianity where, well, the resurrection has begun, but our resurrection hasn't arrived, and so you have this tractor pulling history forward in a teleological way.
Causation is totally backwards. That remains to be discovered, and we...
Okay, and again, he said, well, that's causation is backwards, because again, Sam Harris is a very, it's funny because he almost takes on a Thomas Reid common sense philosophy, but he doesn't know it, because in some ways he's echoing the height of modernity in his approach to the world. And again, in huge depths of irony, Jordan Peterson is much more postmodern. And I know if Carl was still watching my videos, he'd freak out at this point. And those of you who follow the comment section know exactly who I'm talking about. And I mean this in all tenderness, because I don't, Carl has... One of the things you learn as a preacher is that if someone comes into your church and after one Sunday is praising you dramatically, there's a good possibility that weeks or months from now, they will leave slamming the door, cursing you with just as much drama. It's just a fact of how human beings are. So anyway, too many side notes.
We would use other intuitions to make that discovery. But again, you do pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and that there's no break.
And right there, you do pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Right there is there a God that I can cry out and he will save me? No. You have only yourself to trust and to believe in.
Branch of science or mathematics or anything fundamental, logic, that can get away from that.
Right, right. Well, and that's another place.
But given that picture, that doesn't render all intuitions equally respectable.
Absolutely.
Right? Someone
agree.
says, well, I happen to have an intuition that Joseph Smith saw those golden tablets and they were, and Mormonism is true. That's not the sort of intuition we're talking about here. Your intuition doesn't grant you...
But notice now, for his illustration, Harris goes back to this historical question that we're going to deal with, especially towards the end of this video, which is where Tom Holland's really going to, where I'm going to play some clips from his podcast. The question, did it really happen? Now I'm not going to say that that question isn't important, because that's usually one way out of this trap. It's not important whether or not it really happened. And I say, no, that is important. But my question is, why is that important? And to get back to the original question, is God available to save? What do you mean by God? What do you mean by available? What do you mean by save? But, well, what about Joseph Smith and those golden tablets? Myself, I'm a skeptic. I don't have a lot of confidence in the Mormon origin story. And of course, in some ways, Tom Holland really gets into this mix when he writes a book, writes history about the Muslim origin story, and looks at it and says, and actually, when I look at Christianity and Islam, or Mormonism, Latter-day Saints and Islam, there's a lot of commonality between those two things. And, I think about what C.S. Lewis wrote to Sheldon Van Auken. I think in some ways the LDS faith and the Islamic faith is sort of going over the top too far, and they've sort of lost the balance that you need to keep in order to deal with these questions.
Insight into history.
What we could say, and this would be an elaboration of Brett's point, is that moral intuitions of the sort that you're describing have different zones of relevance. So there's some things that would only work as an intuition in very delimited areas of time and space, let's say. There's a hierarchy of moral intuitions, and the more profound the intuition, the more it works as a universal truth across context, just like in a scientific truth. So scientific truth is more profound. This is why the postmodernist readings of Thomas Kuhn are wrong, is that the idea that protons are real is really fundamental, because no matter what span of time and space that you pick, you're going to encounter protons.
Now, this is key in terms of this question that we're pursuing, because we're always looking at limits here and framing. And Peterson notes that as far as we can tell, he doesn't actually say that, but you have to put that caveat in there. As far as we can tell, these processes, these laws of physics, the reality. Now, I want us to divorce, when I use that word, I want us to divorce the implicit physicality and materiality in there. It's deep in there, but the reality of the protons, the degree to which they govern, is set in terms of how far they go out, and they go out a long ways. We tend to find that this, now quantum theory and physics seems to work way out there in space, and it works right here. And that was, of course, the difficulty with Newtonian mechanics, because Newtonian mechanics worked really well. I mean, when I studied physics in college, we studied Newtonian mechanics, and because Newtonian mechanics works really well for this world of objects, but these other physical systems and models worked better for the very large and the very small. And so what we're trying to do with these models is to get further out. And what Peterson notes here is that the power of this is because it sort of scales where you are.
Works of time. The idea that protons are real is really fundamental, because no matter what span of time and space that you pick, you're going to encounter protons. It works everywhere. And then with moral intuitions, let's say, or moral a prioris, you have the same issue, is some of them are so delimited that they only work here and now. And those are sort of impulsive, low-level intuitions, a whim even. But some of them are really, really deep. The ones, for example, the one that orients you to make the claim that you made in the moral landscape.
Now, he uses that word orient, and that's so fundamental in this. Remember Jonathan Pageau's conversation with Stephen Woodford, Rationality Rules. Pageau keeps going back to, did I say Peterson? Did I say Pageau? Pageau keeps going back to, and same with Adam Friended, it depends where you are, where you stand. And now, again, Peterson is using oriented now. Now, why all this exaptation? Why all this physicality? Because we have to think in terms of these concepts because that's what our brains are set to do. That's what we are built for. That's the CPU and the GPU working together. And so now Peterson is saying, okay, it depends. The scale here is vital and important.
The intuitions, a whim even, but some of them are really, really deep. The ones, for example, the one that orients you to make the claim that you made in the moral landscape, that the hellish story is bad and the heavenly story is good,
right.
I would say that's one of the deepest, most context-independent moral intuitions, which is kind of the claim.
Now, that context independence is crucial there because that's kind of what we're dealing with in terms of the spatial metaphors. This has to work not only on planet Earth, it has to work on the moon. This model needs to work on the sun, needs to work on the stars, needs to work on the black holes, needs to work in all these different levels.
Claim you make, except you claim that it's
and again,
a fact.
back to my fundamental concern here in the difference with respect to the difference with how we talk.
Okay, what is his fundamental concern? Well, and this is why at the end of this conversation they'll get into prayer. Well, if I close my eyes and pray, and it's interesting that I'm gonna end here when Harris kind of backs Peterson into a corner, but even though it didn't get the cheers from the crowd as much, Peterson backs Sam Harris into a corner when he says, when you close your eyes and pray, you don't know what's going to happen, and you don't know why it works. None of us do. And Harris agrees with that.
Talk about these things. To call that thing God is fine. That's a God I have no problem with, right? But that's not how most people most of the time are using the word. And there's something misleading about that. And that's...
And right here, when Harris says that, that's when it occurs to me, okay, Harris and Peterson are talking about two different gods. Well, what do you mean by God? And well, that is what we're talking about. And that question, that framing of the question puts us back with everyone in the ancient world with respect to this entire project. Because the entire project is there or isn't there a God? That's really a kind of a crappy question. As the Tom Holland conversation pointed out, the far better question is, what on earth do we mean by that word? Because we're not going to give up using the word. And even if we decide to forswear the word out of social cultural pressure, we're not going to give up the concepts because it's just way too powerful an idea for us to live without.
That worries me.
Yeah, well, if the claim that you're making is that we're all deeply confused about the nature of divinity and ultimate reality, it's like, yes, clearly.
Well, another thing we agree on.
I also don't disagree. Look, I've never made the claim that what I'm talking about is like what other people are talking about. I mean, it is in some ways, but...
And here Peterson gets a little defensive, and I can certainly understand why, but I don't think it's helping his cause right now.
I've not made that claim, so I don't see why that's a justifiable criticism. It's like...
Well, no, it's a criticism with respect to the very likely effects of communicating in that way. Because I see the results of that communication. It's a little bit, this is going to sound more invidious than it is, but this is the kind of thing that I get into with Deepak Chopra.
Yeah.
Deepak and I agree about a lot.
I think it's more invidious than it sounds, actually.
Yeah.
And now this is where, okay, so this is, if, say, Sam Harris were to sit down with Tom Holland, well, they probably wouldn't have much of it. Sam Harris wouldn't be very upset with Tom Holland because, well, Tom Holland doesn't seem to be making people into Christians and eating into his audience. But this question of, okay, so then the New Agers, the spiritual but not religion people, when the story verse just kind of goes on its own and becomes untethered from the material physical world, problems start to happen, and we quite rightly sort of lose respect. These people lose status in our eyes.
Yeah. Well, you're not wearing rhinestone glasses. If you graduate to that, we'll have more of a problem. But Deepak clearly wants to let his audience believe that everything they're into is on some level justifiable by...
Justifiable. You're going to find this word justifiable by whom? this is really interesting because Sam Harris's worldview depends to a degree on authority. And, I really like what Mathieu Pajot says about matter being dark, because not only is there no meaning, there's no authority. There's no authority comes from the other side, okay? And authority comes from authors, comes from sub-creators, comes from agents, comes from persons, and there's no authority in this. It's dark, it's meaningless. And what you see Sam Harris do right now, once you use that word justifiable, well, he may, and he certainly means it just in an Ecclesiastes sense, that which is under the sun, but he's now leveraging an argument on authority.
His reading of quantum spookiness, right?
Yeah.
So
again, spookiness. It's a very interesting word that he doesn't, very rationally or consciously select necessarily, but now we're getting into spooky stuff. We're getting into the woo. We're getting into the mysterious. And there's a lot of bullshittery that goes on there. Absolutely granted. I mean, and this is where Tom Holland goes back to talk about the Protestant Reformation, because a big deal in the Protestant Reformation is to call bullshit on a lot of stuff that they see happening in the church. And so, yeah, but in this way, just as Tom Holland says, Richard Dawkins is, Sam Harris is deeply, deeply Protestant.
If you want to go out and just buy a lot of crystals and think they're going to heal you, it has something to do with the quantum nature of reality.
Absolutely nothing like me.
No, but I think Deepak could say, if I got his back to the wall,
yeah.
Deepak could honestly say, listen, I've never said anything about crystals, right? I'm not selling crystals. I've never said they work, but it's the way in which he's failing to make the clear differentiation. The fact that it takes you to...
Okay, there's a line here that must be maintained between the story verse and the matter verse, and if you fudge that line... Now, what Peterson and Tom Holland are pointing to is that line might not be exactly what you think it is or necessarily where you think it is.
20 minutes.
And well, maybe I'll just interrupt for a meme that I saw on the Bridges of Memeing that I think really shows this. This showed up on the Bridges of Memeing Discord on the Bridges of Meaning Discord server and the Bridges of Memeing channel. All animals want to live. Where do you draw the line? And veganbillboard.com. Where do you draw the line? Now, maybe you're saying, well, I'm going to draw the line at animal versus plant. Okay. Where's that line? And okay, so this person draws the line between dog and bunny. They'll eat bunnies, they'll eat horses, they'll eat chickens, they'll eat cows, they'll eat pigs, they'll eat bulls, they'll eat ducks. All right? And that's where they draw the line. But that line, between pet and food. Now, another person I saw drew the line between the horse and the chicken. They'll eat chickens and cows, but they won't eat horses and bunnies. Where do we draw the line? And where does that line come from? That line doesn't come from genetics. And, what it would have been very interesting is you put a human being in that little picture and say, where do you draw the line? Because according to Sam Harris, well, human beings have flesh and genetics and, all right there too. We could throw guinea pigs up on that list. Because right there, well, there's the issue, isn't it? Where do we draw that line? So I just finished my conversation with Brett Sockhold and Cale Zeldin, and it did not disappoint. It was a tremendous conversation. I finally had to call him off at after 2 hours, but I have the feeling we could have gone another 2, which would have been great. but I'll probably post that before I post this, and that hence the interruption in flow. And I just posted the animal. Where do you draw the line? In other words, back to Peterson's point, what do you call pet? What do you call food? Where do you draw the line? You don't get the line from biology. You get the line from the story verse. That's where the line comes from. So when Tom Holland says, is talking about real, I got to fix the sound. Hang on. Zoom always monkeys with the sound, and I have to reset it in some deep settings in the computer. But when Tom Holland talks about believe and whether he believes and what is real, again, the deep assumptions of materialist, physicalist. So when we get into Tom Holland's podcast and he has to deal with the question, did it really happen? Well, we're looking at the word really there. And, well, where is the line really between child, pet, and food? Religions have long dealt with eating prohibitions. Today is Fat Tuesday. Tomorrow is Ash Wednesday, the beginning of Lent that played into our conversation. But Sam Harris wants to say, well, Sam, where is that line? And it's a human line. And I was just reading the comments from someone brought up again, John Gray. That's all downstream of Christianity, which Tom Holland sees clearly, and Sam doesn't play into his view here. All right, let's see if all the settings are still good.
Crystals, I've never said they work, but it's the way in which he's failing to make the clear differentiation. The fact that it takes you 20 minutes to admit
and applause
that a lot of the Bible is filled with barbaric nonsense.
I don't think it took me 20 minutes to admit that.
Well, we'll go to the tape on that.
These things matter. These things matter. And
I'm just saying, it's like you own
look,
it.
If you're saying that there's a danger...
If you're in a parish of 1, or in a parish of 1,000, or a parish of 100,000, but not in the parish that has anything in common with the Bible thumpers in my country who think that Jesus is very likely coming back in their lifetime because he never died. And
now we're going to pay attention to this coming back business, because I didn't know that was integral to Arthur and that mythology, and we're going to go there.
He's going to judge the living and the dead, and there will be a resurrection and hellfire and all the rest.
And again, when Sam Harris says there will be, the assumption, he's presuming underneath that he's talking physical, material. And of course, Jordan Peterson sort of goes there, mythological, symbolic, and that's where we're going to go with this, because, well, the question, is God available to save me? Is God willing to save me? And all of the miracles you find in the Gospels, people coming up to Jesus, can you heal? People aren't stupid. They paid attention to the physical. But again, as Mathieu Pajot says, I don't know if I said his name right, that's part of what that layer is for.
That's not the game you're playing at all. Own it.
It's one of my favorite points in all of these talks. And we talked about Jordan Peterson as father figure in the... If you're listening to this and you first haven't listened to Brett Sockold and Cale Zeldin and the conversation we had, I know some of you don't listen to any of the conversations. You want to listen to that conversation. That conversation was astounding.
Why are you all applauding about that? It's like, what do you mean own it? It's like, I already made my claim. It's like, I'm not playing a religious fundamentalist game. So what's all the applause about? So I don't understand that. And own it, it's like, I was as clear as I possibly could be when I delineated my answer to the question. People say, well, what do you mean by God?
Someone once asked you if Jesus was
resurrected. You want a 1-second answer?
But no.
Well, forget it, man.
Jordan,
Jordan,
wait a minute, hold on.
I think we can actually.
This is a complicated
one
problem.
second. No, I mean, I don't want to end on. I don't want to end on a. No.
And again, we're to the resurrection. Why? Why does the resurrection matter? Is God available to save me? Well, who is me? Me, this story that has been embodied for 57 years. Me, this story that is embodied and has a zip code and a place in space and time. Me, this story that is the father of 5 children. Me, this on and on and on and on.
Note of acrimony, but someone once asked you whether you thought Jesus was literally resurrected, and you said...
And again, literally is the worst used word. Physically. That's what you want. That's far more precise. Physically.
It would take me 40 hours to answer that question. Okay, that's the kind of thing I'm responding to here. You don't need to do that if you have a clear-cut answer to that question.
I don't have a clear-cut answer to that question.
And if you don't, that connects with many other things that we still have to talk about.
If you don't have a clear-cut answer to that question, this is where I hope it doesn't get crowded out by all the other interesting conversations that I'm having. This is where I want to get into this Avi Loeb UFO video, because we're dealing now, I mean, epistemology takes all this attention. We're dealing now in terms of epistemology. And, well, if you can't say he didn't rise from the dead, well, that puts you in a tribe. Is that a physical thing? At an autopsy, can you see whether or not the person believed in the physical resurrection of Jesus Christ? Can you figure that out in an autopsy? No. You might take guesses of it. Maybe they're buried in a churchyard, and maybe yes. But, you know, this question and how it boils down here.
Yeah. If you don't, that connects with many other things that we still have to talk about.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, I
definitely.
mean, because that...
It isn't obvious in the biblical account that Christ was literally resurrected.
It is. He ate a fish.
So it's not simple. This is not simple.
No, but if the question is, do you think he... Well, let's put it probabilistically. I mean, anything's possible. I'll tell you that it's possible that
this is where we get interesting.
He was physically... Well, let's put it probabilistically. I mean, anything's possible. I'll tell you that it's possible that he was physically resurrected. I mean, it's even possible.
But wait a second, I didn't
with respect
say
to quantum
that he
mechanics.
Was.
The point is,
I said it would take me 40 hours to answer the question. I didn't say that he was.
Well, how's this for an answer? Almost certainly not.
Pressure. What kind of pressure is it? Is it factual? Is it reasonable? Or is it status? Is it tribal?
What's wrong with that answer?
You won.
I think I.
You won. I mean, you won. But Sam, is that a reasonable argument you're making? Is that rationality? What is that you're leaning on Jordan with right there?
I think I know what's wrong with that answer.
It's a fine answer, and people have been giving that answer for a very long period of time, but the idea doesn't seem to go away.
Okay, but that's evidence of what exactly?
I don't know.
Okay.
Well, I can tell you one thing it's an evidence of. There's a deep idea.
Let this be the...
And hats off to Brett Weinstein, who did a terrific job at that, because when to jump in, when to not jump in. Good on you, Brett.
Doorway to our next 3-hour conversation.
Sure.
We have 10 minutes left.
Okay. Oh.
And then they're going to get into a video that I have played many, many, many times. But the physicality matters. Did it happen? Did it not happen? The physical resurrection of Jesus Christ? Almost certainly not. Should these stories govern? Is it justifiable to believe them in a public way, or must we put social pressure and status pressure on someone to back down? Is God's saving available to me? If it's true that I have only one life, that isn't inconsequential in terms of how I decide to spend this one life. So off we go then at this point into metaphorical truth. But I don't want to be merely metaphorically cured from cancer or heart disease or a bullet. We don't want a metaphorical drug or a metaphorical army. what is matter for? It is dark, but what is it for? A while ago now, and you can still find this on Amazon, I hope, Becoming Truly Human was Nathan Jacobs' movie that he did, and he's doing movie making, and I should probably try and reconnect with him at some point because I'd be really curious to see what's going on with him. But it's a really interesting movie, and he had a couple of really good lectures that he gave to the Orthodox priests in America. But in that story, there's a very moving story of, and I told it in the Questions for Atheists, where part of why a woman left the church is, well, God's agency. She had a beloved uncle who died, seemingly easily avoidable by smoking in bed. And if God, just watch 1980s Touched by an Angel, or just troll the internet for examples of angelic sightings, why couldn't God just send an angel to take the cigarette out of his mouth and place it in the ashtray? Would that be too much for a God? Is God available to save? And then suddenly, and this is a point I think about often, well, if God can do anything, why didn't he save my uncle? And then we get to the whole Calvinism thing, which, of course, Calvinism for many is a shorthand for double predestination. Maybe God chose to not save him. Why did God choose to save this person over here and not my uncle? Is God making choices? Well, that's sort of the job of God. But then we have this question, well, I don't like others making choices for me. And I think that's part of the reason that people go to the impersonal, because part of the reason we love the impersonal is because we get to choose, because personal agency trumps impersonal. Impersonal is always available, and it leaves us, the person in our imagination, at the point of control. So this is a very hard thing. And again, I talked about it in that video. But now it gets down to, again, this question of action and what really happened. And so this is where sort of the historical, personal God you meet in the Bible who chooses and makes choices and then is incarnated via Christianity into Jesus Christ. And he makes choices, and they're limited on the spot by space and time. The God they like to think of is impersonal and wouldn't hurt or kill anyone because that God doesn't actually do anything. And C.S. Lewis actually talks about this in his book. And so, do I believe in God? Do I believe that I can pray and my prayers will be heard and answered? And so swing back to Tom Holland, who believe in God per se. It's just on the tipping point of that. A God who acts, a God who decides, a God who listens, a God, but the story. I find the world more meaningful. I find the world happier. I find the world more exciting. And again, in contrast to the other woman who found the world less happy to imagine that God did nothing. And so this is where I'm into Tom Holland's new podcast, and I really also enjoy his collaborative partner Dominic Sandbrook in the podcast. These two have a wonderful relationship back and forth, and I heartily endorse this podcast. It is tremendously fun. You can learn a ton from it, but listen to. I'm probably gonna have to check the sound here too. Listen to this episode on Christmas.
Gospel accounts. So I think I'm right in saying you'll know more about this than me because you never miss an opportunity to plug your book about history of Christianity.
But Dominion, available from all good bookshops. Christmas coming up. Rush out and buy it, folks.
Well, people will have missed it. I mean, people have done their Christmas shopping. They don't want to. I mean, maybe it'll be in the sales. Who knows?
Remaining bookshops. Yeah.
Isn't there a difference? Some Gospels say Jesus was born in Bethlehem, and some say Nazareth. Is that right? That there's
And this, of course, questions like this. Okay, so if God is just the force and maybe available to people with midichlorians, or if God is impersonal and again, Nathan Jacobs brings up the movie Life Itself, which is fascinating in here. And how are we to think about this God? And all these naughty little questions about, well, if the Bible were true, and Sam Harrisel, if the Bible were true, surely the maker of the universe would get the details right on the story of his son and insist on that.
They both say no. So there are 4 Gospels, and there are only 2 that give us accounts of the Nativity. Both of them have him being born in Bethlehem. One of them, St. Matthew's Gospel, gives us the account of the 3 wise men coming and the massacre of the innocents. And the other one, Luke, gives us a story about the shepherds.
Right.
And so the Christmas story is a fusion of the 2.
So there's no story in which you get both the shepherds and the wise men?
No. And there are huge issues with it as history.
Okay, as history. Okay, well, what do we mean by history? Well, what do we mean? Well, the physical occurrences, is that what we mean by history? Well, that's certainly a part of it, but I got my BA in history, if you pay attention to history, what are you paying attention to? Is it just these things happened? And again, happened, we mean physically. No, it's what was on their minds, what was their motivation. We see history as, if science is looking at, well, water plus electricity makes hydrology, so then we have hydrogen and oxygen come out of water. Well, you have the First World War and you have the Second World War, and the First World War causes like hydrology, not hydrology, it's can't remember, like a chemical reaction. The First World War causes a chemical reaction, like pouring things in a laboratory. But that's history. So what do we mean by this? And because this is, in fact, well, and why does this connect with God who is able to save?
The obvious. So the Christmas story is a fusion of the 2.
So there's no story in which you get both the shepherds and the wise men?
No. And there are huge issues with it as history.
Issues.
The obvious one would be that the dates are all over the place.
Yeah.
So obviously we date our years from the birth of Christ, but we've got no idea really when the birth of Christ is, because in one of them we've got King Herod is alive and Herod dies in 4 BC. And then in the other one we've got a decree going from Caesar Augustus. And
yes.
We're told that this is when Cyrenius was governor of Syria, and Cyrenius is holding his census in AD 6. So you can't.
And if you're curious about these things, any good commentary on the New Testament, on Matthew or Luke, will go into exhaustive details about this. And this then is going to spur a very big fight because, well, even though these things had been discussed for a very long time, what happens in our zeitgeist, in our collective imaginary, that somehow makes these issues vitally important as to a person's faith?
You can't square the 2.
Okay, that's a pretty big range.
Yeah.
And did that census actually happen, Tom? Is that a real thing?
Well, there was a kind of census, but it certainly wasn't.
And again, if you go into there are a lot. You can find this on YouTube. There's lots of discussion about these kinds of things.
Syria, and Cyrenius is holding his census in AD 6. So you can't square the 2.
Okay, that's a pretty big range.
Yeah.
And did that census actually happen, Tom? Is that a real thing?
Well, there was a kind of census, but
is that a real thing? What do we mean by real?
It certainly wasn't a census in the way that it gets described in the New Testament. And What's absolutely certain is that Joseph would not have been required to go to Bethlehem.
What's absolutely certain,
and it's pretty clear that
at least Joseph is alive.
That whole story is an attempt to get Jesus to Bethlehem in time to be born, because prophecy says that the Messiah will be born.
So we're gonna write this, and this is a lot of I got a lot of commentaries behind me. So we have to write this in order to get Jesus there, and so we've got what we understand to be prophecy. So let's write the story to make sure it fits, and we just look, boy, that sure looks like fudging to me.
In Bethlehem. So
they've retrofitted the story, basically.
They've retrofitted the story. I mean, I think it's pretty clear that Jesus was born in Nazareth. But having said that, I think that you can see that there are kind of enduring themes that will run through probably over the 2,000 years that have followed, and which are part of the Christian tradition to this day. One is the idea that Jesus, Son of God, the Messiah, is essentially, I mean, he's the son of travelers who can't find room in the inn, famously. He's laid in a manger, and the contrast is something that is fundamental to the Christmas story, that God himself has become this tiny baby laid in a stable. So that's crucial, the contrast between greatness and smallness. And that's, I think, why the references to Caesar Augustus and to the Roman governorship and everything, and to Herod, is so important, because you're counterpointing the Christ child to the apparatus of state power.
Now, the whole episode is great, and you should watch it, but I play this part to illuminate, well, what's going on in our minds. And when Tom Holland says, I can't believe... Now, Tom Holland is well acquainted with living with the paucity of physical evidence to collaborate stories from the ancient world, and the amount of difficulty one might have finding sources compared to sources we have today. And so he's sort of, it really isn't demythologizing, it's sort of dehistoricizing the text that we have, and then looking at it as mythology, re-mythologizing, looking at it as mythology, and then the point of the story isn't what happened. Now, again, my point is not to fight this battle, because this battle has been fought for over 100 years now, and far longer than that in many respects. But I want to point to this battle and look at sort of the underpinnings beneath it, how these particular things work within this battle. Now, I'm going to pick on Lydia McGrew a little bit, because Lydia has just come onto the YouTube scene, and Lydia is a very interesting figure. I should probably have her on my channel. I think she'd probably agree to it. She is making YouTube videos basically saying so part of, okay, let me lay the landscape here. And I was just, again, re-listening to my first conversation with Cale Zeldin that we had on my channel. We were talking about Fuller Seminary. And so there's sort of hardline fundamentalists that, in the wake of the modernist fundamentalist theory, wanted to say everything happened in the Bible just like that. Then they have to deal with some awkward details that are sometimes a little hard to sort of piece together between the Gospels. It's often called the synoptic problem, okay? And so there are plenty of texts that do just that will explain away all of these problems. Now, when I remember starting my first course in the Gospels at Calvin Seminary, and David Howard was our professor. Now, the Christian Reformed Church is sort of middle of the road here, and David Howard explained to us how he started out as a New Testament scholar doing just that, explaining how all of the pieces fit together, and there are no historical issues. And they basically said, I got tired of it, and I wondered whether that was really the point of all of this. And so a lot of, whereas he was quite conservative, the other voice comes out and says, well, some of the differences in the Gospels are not necessarily simply attributable to different perspectives of eyewitnesses. And again, people like Sam Harris could easily wade in and say, well, wouldn't it be convenient for the Almighty to at least get the story straight before he delivers it to us in the authorized book? Which is a powerful argument. And then people will come back and say, well, in my tradition, blunt it with organic inspiration rather than mechanical, because again, Mormons and Muslims both have mechanical inspiration. No, this is organic inspiration. And others will come and say, well, sort of what we have in the 4 canonical Gospels, the questions between them have very long been known. In fact, very early on, there was the attempt to harmonize these Gospels, and the church resisted that attempt. The church wanted to keep these Gospels as, and if you think about it this way, it's rather a powerful argument, the church wanted to keep these Gospels as eyewitness testimony. And so in a court of law, let's say, if you have 4 witnesses to, let's say, the storming of the Capitol in Washington, D.C., rather than the court sitting down in a back room with all of these witnesses and trying to get their story straight and trotting out someone with the organized story, you let all of the witnesses speak. And then they say, well, how are these eyewitnesses? And then you look at Baucham's book about the eyewitnesses and the Gospels, and you can pull that out. So someone like Lydia McGrew is sort of on the conservative end of this, and she's not way at the edge, but she is more on the conservative end than others who want to say, no, that what's clearly important from the Gospels is the symbolism and the mythology. And so Jordan Peterson says, I didn't say he physically rose from the dead. Okay, and Sam Harris wants to have him, pressure him and bully him into almost certainly not. And you almost, I don't know if it's, you won, is that, and I wish Jordan had come out, in that moment, recognize the peer pressure. Now, again, if you look at my conversation with Brett and Cale, there's a power to standing up to that kind of pressure and say, no, you're not going to get me to say that. Now, all of this has been worked through for a very long time, and that's where George Marsden's book, Fundamentalism and American Culture, is really helpful, because what happened in the fight was, well, it's polarization. It's one or the other. Either these books are mythology, or these books are a particular kind of record, especially a particular kind of record that you and I would embody. And it was noteworthy in my conversation with John Sook that this was sort of true in the Christian Reformed Church, and it's really quite true of my position. I often say, well, do you have evidence that it didn't happen this way? And what you discover is that the skeptics sort of lean on David Hume and say, well, and it's exactly what Sam Harris does, well, in all probability, and C.S. Lewis comes in there and says, probability is kind of a funny thing, because history is full of enormously improbable things. Just look at the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. I mean, talk about a story of enormous improbabilities that launched the First World War. There we are. And so again, my point, you can go on the internet and find this historicity question struggled over, and it comes through again and again and again in conversations that I have with people who are demythologizing and struggling with those questions. So it's a valid question, and I'm not trying to either sidestep the question or say it's invalid, but I think it bears looking underneath the question and saying, well, why do we feel this way about history? And that is exactly the kinds of transcending I think we're seeing in the likes of Tom Holland and Jordan Peterson right now, and it's sort of tentative moving towards it. Why does history matter so much? I don't hear this question asked. It's sort of assumed, and so that's what drove me to make this video, because I had to sit down and say, why does history in this way, physical history, matter the way it does? It seems to matter greatly to us, and I think good reason, and I think it should. But how and why, especially because, again, reading the ancients, did it matter to them the way it mattered to us? And it certainly mattered to them. C.S. Lewis makes this point again with respect to, let's say, the virgin birth. Joseph knew very well how babies came into the world, according to the story. And when Mary shows up pregnant, Joseph is ready to dismiss her quietly. That's a very rational response to a set of circumstances. So what's happening in that story? Joseph is not irrational. And then why wouldn't, and this is a question that to me speaks to the validity, the historical validity, or lest we use another freighted word, the authenticity of the Gospels. And the Gospels don't seem to take everything into the back room and fix it up pretty to bring it out front. You can, leave that to modern people to do if they wish. And the church resisted this as well. Why? And it seems to me there is beneath that an ancient assumption within the church, and understanding that, well, all of this stuff is fretted and freighted, but it's the cover-up that gets you in trouble, which you learn from the Nixon administration. So we have to ask this question: why does history matter so much? We are small, short-term creatures constantly recalibrating our plausibility structures. That's who we are and what we do. And so physicality, materiality, what physically happened matters. Whether or not Jesus rose from the dead physically matters. And we're doing this all the time individually. We're always recalibrating. We know that there's plenty of bullshittery all around the world, and so we've got a nose for it, because when you get enough of it, it stinks, and you try and smell it out. But we're also doing it as tribes and as groups, and so the deconstructions and the conversions and Sam Harris leaning on Jordan Peterson with almost certainly not, and all of this. This is always in play, and the past is, what happened physically in the past is vitally important for us to recalibrate what can happen in the future. And so, let's give due respect to David Hume and probability. We're working on those probabilities, but now to bring in C.S. Lewis, who leans against it in his book on miracles and says, but what is the statistical reality of the history we have? Isn't it infinitesimal? It's the whole question about how many monkeys on a typewriter do you need to yield, and how much time do you need to yield the works of William Shakespeare? Can you get that into your 16 billion year story of this, or do you have to smuggle stuff through some other windows? And that's where a whole group of people in who are skeptics about lots of things that we have contemporary unanimity surrounding evolution or all sorts of other things. That's where these skeptics play a role, and they say, hey, wait a minute. And I listen to James Tour and some of the stuff he makes, and he's like, oh, y'all say that you just have soups and volcanic fissures and out comes life. He's like, he's a world-class scientist. He says, we don't really know. Can we be honest with that? Surely we should be honest. And again, this is where that video about the Harvard physicist who is basically chiding his colleagues, saying, you're sort of not being good scientists when it comes to this strange thing that we saw out in space and we couldn't really explain it. Shouldn't we be open-minded? I mean, who really Almost certainly not. Well, okay. Improbable? Absolutely. But the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand was enormously improbable, yet it happened. Our imagination and conviction of what really happened, and again, it's so often governed by our imagination, and I'll point again to that great video of Dallas Willard, The Nature and Necessity of Worldviews, on the Veritas Forum, where he talks about the young man on the university, how you have all this social pressure to, well, here's the little box that we believe in. You better not stray from that box. We're going to tag you in terms of you're going to be, Sam Harris said it so well, you're going to be part of those people. You don't want to be part of those people, Jordan. Well, if you've learned anything about Jordan, you start bullying him. It doesn't go well with Jordan B. Peterson. He's not a man to be bullied or to try and push into a corner. And, what happened there with Sam was about the most I've seen done to Jordan. Other than that, you'll fester on it, it'll stir on it, and he'll come back at you. And he's pretty darn sharp and he's pretty darn articulate. So our imagination and conviction about what really happened, well, we anticipate the future by looking at the past. And it's why the miracles debate won't go away. And it's why the story of Jesus' physical resurrection won't go away. Because these laws of physics weren't found in the ground like golden plates in upstate New York. In all fairness, they're deduced. And, Rupert Sheldrake comes along and says, well, if the constants are so constant, why do we have an office that has to track them? And when I heard that, I was like, wow. Well, they move around. Well, why would they move around? What does that say about these laws of physics? And again, Jordan Peterson, very rightly said, but these particles scale out, and so we can look at physics, and we have this lesson between Newtonian mechanics and quantum mechanics, and then wherever physics is going from there. The world is a very strange place. And so when you're messing around with probability, you're messing around with certain groups and tribes of probability. And many people have rationality is sort of a coherence device between things. And if you have experiences different from others, well, they're not going to see probability the way you do. And I've had a lot of experience with this. I've seen things I can't explain or understand. And maybe the amazing Randy will come in and maybe offer $1 million, or maybe he won't pay out. But I've seen strange things by very credible people. And I just simply don't believe the little iron box that some of these people put the world in. Call me a dupe. Here's the thing about not having much status. I don't got much to lose. Call me what you want. I don't care. It's status. So there's this gatekeeping that goes on, and you gain or lose status in your group based on how you posture yourself with respect to these. And again, Dallas Willard tells a story in that video that's just absolutely perfect. Someone at church will say he believes, but go on to the university and you have all of these. Why did you build those buildings so dramatic? Stanford University and Yale. Why all the monumentality? Why don't you build your university, high status universities, to look like some lousy strip mall, like some crappy junior college and butt stink nowhere? No, you're Yale, you're Stanford. You build impressive monumentality. What is that about? Where's that line? It's, Sam, can you really tell me the shape of the building has nothing to do with reinforcing the social imaginary that the owners of the buildings have constructed? That's the whole point of status and image and symbolism. And what happens when our incredibly impressive, incredibly powerful, incredibly effective medical establishment can't heal you? There's only one you. Talking, well, in 99.9% of the cases, this treatment worked. You are not a statistic. You are a statistic of one. And so, well, that's when people light out for the territory, the nonconformist territory. And of course, Michaela Peterson lived in that. And, when Sam's talking about crystals and Jordan's like, that's not me. What happens when it's benzo withdrawal and no place in Canada or the United States can really quite know how to treat Jordan? And so Michaela takes a chance and takes him to Russia, and it works. What do you do with that? And, and this goes on for the spiritualist people. I mean, eat, pray, love. High status journalist, gets a divorce and, what am I going to do with my life? I'm going to go to India and look at crystals and I'm going to meet a man and just follow. Just follow Gilbert's novel about, I'm saying goodbye to marriage, but my new hubby needs a visa, so I guess I'll say hello to marriage again. Status be damned. Lion diet to treat your arthritis. Going to Moscow to get dad off benzos. Start listening to Benny Hinn or make a pilgrimage to Bethel Redding if your life isn't working and it gives you personal option, financial, social constraints. The guru, the healer, the preacher is all you can really afford. It's so funny. I listen to all of these high status people about people of color, and then I turn on to YouTube and the First Church of Truth of God broadcast. Caught Rick watching it on Sunday. Rick's like, I showed Rick a live stream from an Orthodox church and said, and Rick's like, I like listening to this guy. He's entertaining, and we're dancing in church, and we're getting healed, and we're saying amen, and we're pounding on the Bible, and you got the dude behind him reading the Bible, and it's like, the thing about status is most people don't have it. That's how status works. And so you're going to talk probability and all of this stuff. Fine. And yeah, when it's my turn for the vaccine, stick it in my arm. I'm not a skeptic. And I've been one who have leaned on so many people when they become YouTube doctors and Facebook doctors. And I look at that and I think, man, I'll still go with the science, but you are not a statistic. You are a sample of one. And when it comes to your life and death, you make choices on it. And when the medical establishment and all of the high status stuff doesn't seem to work with you, what does it say that the Petersons, who had money and status, light out for the Russian territory and get the fix in Russia? And I love the story where Jordan wakes up and looks at Michaela and says, "You're in big trouble." And what's the probability of this? But it's real. And as a pastor, I see it all the time. The strangest things happen in this world all the time. And that's why I love doing conversations with randos. You want to know why? They don't have any status, and so all of this socio-cultural probability that is taking the grime and the high resolution out, and it's cutting the stories down, and I'm not going to tell this story on YouTube because I'm going to lose status. Well, if they don't have any status, they'll tell me. And are they wrong? Is there bullshittery around? There absolutely is. But it's real. And you know it, and they might be wrong, and I see it all the time. People believing bad information, and it costs them plenty. On and on. And I watch people getting taken in by Nigerian email schemes. I watch people making bad medical decisions, bad financial decisions, bad relational decisions. If you're a pastor of a local church with a whole variety of low status people, you're going to see it all the time. You're going to watch pastors give bad advice. On and on and on and on and on. But again, we are a statistic of one. And part of what agency means, you get to decide and roll the dice and take your chances and take your risk. So I listened to Christmas, and Tom, and of course I talked to Esther O'Reilly about that, and Esther because Esther's following Tom Holland and Jordan Peterson like I am, and show up on my channel sometimes, but blog, and Esther's a terrific writer, and so. But then Tom and Dominic make an episode about King Arthur, and that was fascinating.
It's all true, or it ought to be. So said Winston Churchill of the legend of King Arthur. Romantic historical story or just an invented myth? Well, welcome to The Rest is History with me, Dominic Sambrook, and my very own Mordred, Tom Holland. Tom.
Now again, why this little area? Because that's what this video is about. Why does it matter whether it's history? What about King Arthur? Now, part of what's fun about looking at someone like King Arthur, if we're looking at the dynamic, let's look at Arthur because, well, what are the stakes on this? What does it mean for someone to be a historical figure? And of course, this is where the either or of modernity and fundamentalism sort of gets at play.
I should say that in the script, Dominic, it says my very own Galahad. So
I know, but I was never going to read that out.
Very subtly done.
Yeah. I was hoping you wouldn't notice. So let's kick off. This is a great subject. King Arthur was my very first historical enthusiasm. So I read the Ladybird King Arthur books. I read Antonia Fraser's book about the Knights of the Round Table. And I think I read those before I read anything about real kings.
What's happening here? What's happening in his childhood? What is this line, and how, for what I know, Dominic Sandbrook is not a member of the royal family. He will never be King of England. Why look at Arthur? And again, Jordan Peterson stuff just flows in naturally. Well, these are archetypal stories. These are idealized. Jesus Christ is the idealized man. He's the archetype of the good man, of the right man. And so, well, you feed your children these things. And again, instead of giving a child a list of, and this is why our Sunday school materials go so wrong, give children lists of this is good and this is bad. No, that's law. That comes later, and even so, it's got plenty of tricky things about it. This is how people are formed through story.
That was probably true of lots. It's a great subject. King Arthur was my very first historical enthusiasm. So I read the Ladybird King Arthur books. I read Antonia Fraser's book about the Knights of the Round Table. And I think I read those before I read anything about real kings. That was probably true of lots of people who get into history, isn't it? You start with King Arthur and Robin Hood, and then you get into the enclosures and dissolution of the monasteries and all the really exciting, glamorous subjects.
Yes. There's always the vague feeling attaching to reading about the enclosures that knights with pennants are just a lot more fun. And I suppose hanging over this entire theme is the obvious one, which summed up very effectively by Tom McTague, the UK correspondent for The Atlantic, who asks, Arthur, who, what, why, how?
Right.
And I guess you could express that as basically, did he exist?
Yeah.
Why do we want to know this? Because people on one hand will say, well, it doesn't matter whether he really existed. It's just how the story inspires us. Yeah, but if he didn't really exist, it isn't such an inspiration, is it? What do we lose? And again, we started out this video, Tom Holland talking, he was wooed by the Greeks and the Romans. He was wooed by the classical period. He wanted to live into it. But first he was wooed by dinosaurs, and then to learn he's just a thrush. Don't you want to be a dinosaur? Don't you want to be a real Jedi? Don't you want to have a real lightsaber? Don't you want to have a real wand? Don't you want to really face a Balrog and have real magic? I mean, this is where we're going with this.
So, Dominic, are you a skeptic or a believer?
Well, that's it. To my mind, I guess if I like to believe that Arthur existed, of course, because I'm a romantic. But ultimately, I suppose my instinct is that
I'm a romantic. But even there, you've just sort of cut the legs. I'm a romantic. I like to think about it. But that's not like saying I'm a Jordan Peterson basement dweller, covered in Cheetos, just playing video games all the time while my mom goes to work every day to keep the lights on and the broadband coming.
there were multiple Arthurs, right? That probably there were multiple warlords and generals, some of them Roman leftovers, some of them Celtic.
And again, if you look at biblical studies, all of these options are put on the table again and again. Well, this is a composite. And again, composites are all over the place in literature. Or an exemplar, someone who sort of comes in to stand for the composites, and biblical storytelling uses that. Why all the stories around Elijah and King Ahab and Jezebel? Was it just about Elijah and Jezebel? No, because the whole way this thing works is it's not just about them. That's sort of the point of an archetype and an archetypal story that again, the one great line, the great line Jordan Peterson has when someone says, why can't we tell the archetypal story? No, because archetypal stories have to be enfleshed in reality, in context. And so these things go both ways.
Some of them may be, I like to believe that Arthur existed, of course, because I'm a romantic. But ultimately, I suppose my instinct is that there were multiple Arthurs, right? That probably there were multiple warlords and generals, some of them Roman leftovers, some of them Celtic, some of them maybe even Germanic, who sort of fed into the Arthur legend at the end of Roman Britain in that sort of period that we think of as the Dark Ages, and that, you know, it wasn't completely invented, that there must have been grains of truth, as there always are in historical myths. But anyway, Tom, this is your field. You're on home turf. You should be answering this question.
I don't think he existed.
He's a trained historian. This is the skepticism that we build into the system. And again, we're back to the virus that gets out of the lab. This is the virus that we use in science, this skepticism. And again, to Avi Loeb's conversation with Lex Friedman, it gets out of the lab and it's all over the place. It's the skepticism. You know, I just finished this conversation with Brett and Cale, and it's once you start learning that deconstruction is a powerful tool, we're just going to deconstruct everything. And then once you've deconstructed everything, then suddenly this beautiful vision in Syria of Al-Qaeda and of the Islamic State, and you know, people will leave North America and Europe to fight under a banner, but they kind of got bullshitted from it. And now you say, well, that's the Muslim, and how fair is that for you to pick on them? There's plenty of that going on with Christianity. I see it all the time. It's like, oh, everything's going on in Bethel Redding. I've got to get up there. I've got to be a part of it. And go. You know, the old saying, beware of people when they meet their heroes, because, and again, we talked a lot about that with Cale and Brett, but it's the beautiful vision.
You know, this word euhemer.
There must have been grains of truth, as there always are in historical myths. But anyway, Tom, this is your field. You're on home turf. You should be answering this question.
I don't think he existed. You know, this word euhemerism.
I didn't know that word, and so I had to look up that word. And I was really glad I looked up the word. It's a very interesting word. Euhemerism is an approach to the interpretation of mythology in which mythological accounts are presumed to have originated from real historical events or personages. Euhemerism supposes that historical accounts become myths as they are exaggerated in the retelling, accumulating elaborations and alterations that reflect cultural mores. This is very true. I listened to this. Yeah, this is cool. Yeah. It was called for the Greek mythographer Euhemerus, who lived in the late 4th century BC. In a more recent literature of myths, such as Bulfinch's mythology, euhemerism is termed historical theory of mythology. Euhemerus was not the first to attempt to rationalize, funny choice of words, mythology in historical terms. Euhemerus, of course, this gets into another great episode, 2 episodes actually in this podcast, is on Troy, because of course, well, we were skeptical about Troy and this is a made-up story, and then there was the great search for the historical Troy, and this is part of the. See, we look at this in terms of history, and we look at these issues that are things way back where we have very, very little access to, but America can't come to terms with what happened in the Trump administration. Are we lacking evidence? Do we not have dates? Is it the search for the real historical Trump? Who is Donald Trump? Can we agree on that? No. Why? And so we look at, okay, you want skepticism? We look back and we say, oh, we should be skeptical. Well, maybe we should be a little skeptical about ourselves in all of this. Now, this euhemerism goes back a long ways, and you find it in with Socrates and Plato's Phaedrus, and the tomb of Zeus, and Christians, and this was very hostile to paganism. The early Christians, such as the Church Fathers, embraced euhemerisms in an attempt to undermine the validity of the pagan gods. And one thing that Tom Holland brings up again and again and again, and I don't know. There's not as much of a cult following for Tom Holland as there is Jordan Peterson. I mean, if there is a cult following of Tom Holland, I'm probably it. But yeah, I'll be skeptical and critical of people I like. I don't know how you could be married and not be skeptical and critical of people you like, or have family or children. That's part of what it means to like and love someone. If you're, let's not have idols here, okay? So the Protestants did this, and everybody's trying to recalibrate all the time. The early Christian apologists deployed euhemeristic arguments to support their position that pagan mythology was merely an aggregate of fables of human intervention. Cyprian, a North African convert to Christianity, wrote a short story on the vanity of idols in AD 247 that assumed the euhemeristic rationale as though it needed no demonstration. Cyprian begins that those are no gods whom the common people worship is known from this. They were formerly kings, who, on account of their royal memory, subsequently began to be adored by their people even in death. Thence temples were founded to them. Thence images were sculptured to retain the countenances of the deceased by likeness. The men sacrificed victims and celebrated festival days by way of giving them honor. Thence to posterity these rites became sacred, which at first had been adopted as a consolation. Now go all the way back to the first Tom Holland video I played, and right there you see, well, he's talking about atheism, and Christianity is like, I kind of come to my atheism through Christianity. I kind of come to my skepticism through Christianity. Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris are just, far advanced, over-the-hill Protestants of a kind. And Cyprian proceeds directly to 2 examples. The apotheosis of Melicertes and Laothea. The castors, Castor and Pollux, die by turns that they may live. A reference to the daily sharing back and forth of their immortality by the heavenly twins. The cave of Jupiter is seen in Crete and his sepulchre shown, Cyprus says, co-founding Zeus and Dionysus by showing that the Minoan cave cult is still alive in Crete in the 3rd century AD. In his exposition, it is Cyprian's argument to marginalize the syncretism of pagan belief in order to emphasize the individual variety of local beliefs. From this religion of the gods is variously changed among individual nations and provinces, inasmuch as no one god is worshipped by all. but by each one of the worship of its own ancestors is kept peculiar. Eusebius, and so on and on and on and on. And Middle Ages, the Christ myth theory, what Christians sort of spin out is brought back, and on and on and on. So lots of good footnotes in the Wikipedia reference on this. Okay, back to the podcast.
The idea that in the distant past.
Anyway, Tom, this is your field. You're on home turf. You should be answering this question.
I don't think he existed. This word euhemerism. The idea that in the distant past you have mortals, kings, powerful figures who go on over the course of time, become elevated and end up as gods.
Yeah.
But I think that Arthur is a kind of interesting example of something going the opposite way. That I think he's essentially a kind of mythical figure, a figure of folklore who gets attached to a specific historical narrative. And the reason that can work is that, as you said, the setting for Arthur are the century, maybe 2 centuries after the collapse of Roman Britain, which is the 2-century period that really we struggle to fit a narrative onto it.
Yeah.
We have so few written sources, and the evidence from archaeology, from genetics and everything is so contradictory and so complex that, in a sense, if you wanted to slot a mythical figure and imagine, cast him, construct him as someone who had actually existed, that's the period that you would do it. But I think that, I guess...
Now, what's interesting is whether someone just does this and it gets carried on because the sociology is ready for it. Did someone make up a story and it just gets passed on? Does this come up sort of subconsciously and it's an archetype gets attached and nobody pays attention to it? And how do we know? How does this thing work? And that gets back to this question. Well, why does the past matter to us? And so I want to make a few observations. These are some thoughts that I had when I was thinking about this. Power and validation in our communal imagination, because this is really a communal thing, because this is something, it impacts us, but it impacts our status. So it's in our social imaginary because elements of our social imaginary deeply impact status. So there's power and validation in our communal imaginary. This is real enough to get people into the streets. Oh, there's a piece of that Arthur thing I wanted to play.
But I think that I guess there are 2 problems, really. One is that the sources that mention Arthur are incredibly late.
Right. So they're well after the event.
Yes, almost. So there's a description of a raid that was launched by some Welsh-speaking Britons from the region of Edinburgh against what's thought to be the Roman fort of Catterick. And this is set about 600, and the guy who is describing it claims at the beginning of the poem, a guy called Aneurin says, "I am narrating it," and he's supposed to have lived around 600. And in that poem, there is a phrase that this warlord pulls off great feats, but he was not Arthur, is the phrase.
Oh,
so
yes,
if we can identify that at 600, then that is evidence for it being very early.
And you see here how what is an Arthur in the Gospels? Jesus asks, I just read this last Sunday, "Who do people say that I am?" "You're Elijah." Well, what does that mean? Is there a historical Elijah? You're Elijah. Well, because of what Elijah is doing, because of what Elijah has done.
Arthur being somebody that people will know, and that people will say, "Is he an Arthur, isn't he?" So that's pretty big, isn't it? I mean, doesn't that suggest...
Except that this is a poem that was first written down in the 9th century, and the earliest manuscript we have of it is the 13th century. So There's a lot of potential for Chinese whispers there. And even if it was, written in 600, he was no Arthur. I mean, Arthur could still be a mythical figure.
Yes, like you'd say he was no Heracles, or
Yes, yeah. Exactly.
And then what about these people like Gildas? So Gildas is somebody who writes about Arthur, isn't he? Tell me about Gildas.
Right, so Gildas is again, difficult to pin him down exactly, but he's probably writing about 500. And he does give a kind of garbled narrative of what's going on, even though it's completely shot through with all kinds of Old Testament imagery. So he's not writing a kind of straight history. And he does give us, he gives us a portrait of a haughty tyrant who subsequently gets identified with a guy called Vortigern, inviting Saxon mercenaries in. Then you have Britain imploding, you have a state of warfare. And this conventionally is the period that you associate with Arthur, but it's not Arthur who is mentioned. It's a guy called Ambrosius Aurelianus, who is described as the last of the Romans. And Arthur isn't there. So it's a yawning gap. So why does Gildas not mention Arthur? I guess there are various.
But hold on, don't people think that Ambrosius Aurelianus is Arthur? That's a lot of the stuff that I've read. People say, well, this is obviously Arthur, that was his real name. Is that just balderdash?
It's kind of quite desperate because he's not called Arthur. I mean, he's called Aurelianus. So why is Gildas not mentioning Arthur? It could be because he hasn't heard of him. Yeah. So Arthur is operating in some other area of the country that the Gildas hasn't heard. Or it could be that Gildas has a problem with Arthur. So in a lot of the early saints' lives that you get in Wales and other Celtic areas, Arthur is often cast as a kind of problematic figure who preys on the church. So perhaps that's the reason.
So he's been cancelled. Gildas has cancelled him.
Yeah, or perhaps he just doesn't exist. You know, he's an imaginary figure. And I think that's the likeliest explanation. Where Arthur does appear in what seems to be a historical record is in a Welsh history series of texts, of chronicles and so on, that is attached to the name of a Welsh writer called Nennius. But again, it's all very confusing. And this is the one that gives the famous list of 12 battles that Arthur is supposed to have won, culminating in the Battle of Badon, which we can be fairly confident is a battle that was fought because Gildas mentions it. But he doesn't associate it with Arthur. He doesn't even specifically say that it's Ambrosius Aurelianus who won the Battle of Badon. He doesn't say who the Battle of Badon was against. He doesn't really provide a solid date for it. So the whole thing is a kind of, it's a mess. And I think that being so, you've got to ask, well, why and how would the legend of Arthur emerge? And I think that it's pretty clear that what's going on is that you have a Welsh-speaking tradition that is very hostile to what it sees as a takeover of its lands by.
Now we have a two-level theory. There's all of this stuff underneath, and it gets expressed as a story. And again, you don't have to be skeptical about that thing. That's what we do. Inherit the Wind, the movie about the Scopes trial, the Scopes monkey trial, expresses their feelings about the maker's feelings about McCarthyism. We do this kind of thing all the time.
Saxons. And likewise, in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, you have a very similar account of Saxons and Angles sweeping westwards, conquering the homelands of the Britons, pushing them into Wales, seen from the other side. And traditionally, this has been understood to be a historical narrative, that the Romans withdraw, that the Britons invite in the Saxons then conquer what becomes England. Arthur supposedly wins the Battle of Badon, keeps the Saxons at bay for a few decades. The Saxons then come back in. And that's a kind of narrative that has been repeated and is still kind of widely held to. But I think it's a fantastical one. That's not what actually the archaeological evidence shows, and it's not what the genetic evidence shows.
Let me interrupt you. So modern sort of academic historians, very recently, especially if they're quite woke, shall we say, they think that this is the wrong narrative because it presents immigration as kind of contested and it's all done with fire and sword. And they sort of argue, oh no, it was much more gradual and there was an assimilation, that the idea that the Saxons came in and they drove Arthur and the Britons all into Wales is all balderdash, and it was this sort of multicultural process and all the rest of it. Do you buy all that? Is that your take on it all?
I don't think it's about woke anxieties about immigration. I think it's about the fact that all the evidence on the ground, the archaeological evidence, shows very little sign, and the genetic evidence shows very little sign of a kind of mass invasion. Basically, the Angles and the Saxons, like the Welsh, they're all descended from the people who lived in Roman Britain.
And so here you have the question about the historicity of the Joshua invasion. I mean, these kinds of questions emerge. You look for evidence. You do all of this kind of thing. And it's especially important when you get to the end there where they're talking history is always relevance realization with respect to what we decide to pay attention to, what we decide to write about, has everything to do with us. And anyone who looks at the historicity of not just the history, but who looks at the writing of history as it goes back, people are writing history concerned about the things that are going on in their present time. And the question we're looking at here is, well, why does history matter? Why does history matter? Again, the big question we started out with, is God available to save? Is God available to save me from this invasion? How are we to think about this invasion with respect to morality? So you've got power and validation in our communal imaginary. This is real enough to get people in the streets, to get them to topple governments, to inspire armies to conquer, to move people to kill or to risk their lives for the sake of hopes and dreams. This stuff is real, and it's the present and the past that are always in this tension, and we see the present through the eyes of the past. We constantly do that. Again, we've talked quite a bit about projection. Point to Jordan Peterson's great conversation with Roger Scruton in terms of we sort of see low-resolution cartoons. And when we see someone, we see that person through the eyes of what has been in the past. The dog who is afraid of men with beards because the first owner of that dog who had a beard beat that dog. The woman who is afraid of a certain kind of man because the man who looked that way physically did something to, once bit, twice shy. Power recalibration of human beings. All of this stuff is at play. And so part of what happens about our relationship with history is a validation of historical claims. And you see this at play. This is our land, and you have ethnicity and tribal identity at play there. You, a collective group identity, did us, another group identity. You did us wrong, and now you, the heirs of that identity, must pay us, the heirs of another identity, for the sake of justice. And again, you don't find justice in that hole in the ground where you find the golden plates in upstate New York and the laws of physics. What is justice? It's deeply contingent upon a narrative integrity. And we see that at play currently in all of our politics. And so this question about what really happened in 1619, what really happened in 1492, what really happened on January 6th, what really happened on Election Day 2016 and 2020, what really happened has everything to look at through the history of it. The lion ate the lamb, therefore all lions are killers, and all flocks of sheep. This is the way we work. We look at validation of inheritance claims through history. That's why history and what really happened matters. We look at validations of inheritance, inspiration, and potentialities. Is this Elijah or John the Baptist risen from the dead? It's interesting if you listen later on, and again, the whole podcast is great. I mean, all of those, I really enjoy all of those podcasts. Arthur will return. What does that mean? Are we talking a physical resurrection of King Arthur? Or he was no Arthur because he was unable to take the castle? When Donald Trump wins the election, is he a new Andrew Jackson, for better or for worse? Is Joe Biden a new Barack Obama? Arthur will return, but he was no Arthur. He was no Heracles or Hercules. He's not the man his father was. Why is Jesus the Son of God? What does that mean? All of this stuff. He is the coming of the Lord. He is the coming of the Lord to Israel. Why is Jesus considered, part of a Trinity? What is the Spirit of the Lord? All of this stuff is at play. If Jesus and Peter could walk on water, why not me here and now? What enabled them? What is preventing them? Now, I spoke in a previous video about implicit historicity causality. Even deeply conservative people see historical causality and its consequences. And so a lot of what we do is retracing the steps of a historical narrative in order to get back on track to the eschaton, or to show where your rivals got it wrong, thus invalidating the morality of their present stance. And I haven't delved into this book too deeply yet, but Carl Trueman recently wrote The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, and a number of you have recommended that book to me. But this is a deeply Protestant move. And it was interesting, again, talking to Cale and Brett. These moves are being made in terms of the Roman Catholic Church. In my first conversation with Cale, where he talks about, when Pope John Paul II and Cardinal Ratzinger becomes Pope Benedict, the conservatives imagined, we've won it forever. We've turned the tide. Well, progressives in America, with Barack Obama's presidency, we've won it together. We've turned the tide. And then Donald Trump is elected, and I always forget that guy. I should put it in the slides. But, was it Sorkin? Writes a letter to his daughter that, this will never happen again. Really? The Republicans are never again going to control the White House or the Congress? I expect they'll likely control the Congress come 2022. Americans seem to like divided government. That's sort of how the government was designed to operate. But all this implicit historical causality, we use this, and we look to the past to find our lessons, to validate, to promote, to navigate, to calibrate. That's why we care if it really happened. And in fact, the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 says, well, if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then our hope is in vain, because everything for Paul rests on the physical resurrection of Jesus, which is why he goes to Jerusalem and looks up James and looks up Peter and looks up eyewitnesses, because, well, he's not a scientist, but he understands how history works. And if Jesus rose from the dead, it means something. Well, what does it mean? And, even if you can, a few hundred years ago, yeah, Jesus rose from the dead, but so what? People aren't calculating machines. Just because something flips in our mind, it doesn't mean that everything's going to flip. But again, the dominant question, is God's saving power available to me? When I get in a fix and when I cry out to God, does it matter? If Jesus did have the power to remap matter, to still a storm or raise the dead or heal the sick or multiply loaves and fishes or change water into wine, it matters, because that says something about him. Now, what exactly does it say about him, and what exactly does it say about reality? If Jesus did have the power to remap matter with a word, how might that impinge on me going about my little life? Now, my dog doesn't feel any compulsion. If I would sit down with my little dog and explain how Jesus rose from the dead, it wouldn't change him a bit. Now, if I sit down and explain it to someone else, they might not believe me, because all of this is playing on it. Does it matter if I masturbate or steal or waste my life playing video games or doing drugs? And I'm speaking about what comes in the conversation with metaphorical truth and Brett Weinstein trying to bridge the gap between Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris. It does matter, because we're looking to recalibrate, and sort of what we're doing with all of these talks is saying, I won't recalibrate, because this is what I think. This little box about what can and can't happen is all that ever happened and all that ever will happen. And even Sam Harris will back off a little bit from that, but say almost certainly not. But when I find, well, what is the difference between Christians and non-Christians, not even that. Atheists, where is the line? Well, it seems to be, if I call on him, will he answer? Can he change my life? And now again, back to Tom Holland and, well, Cyprian, they were dealing with this stuff. Well, how does the world really work? Really work? That's the question we're trying to answer. And, well, one might have an open mind, but keep looking at the past and keep looking at the present. Got a lot in there. It was divided by another conversation that I had. I have to figure out when, where, how. I'm going to post all these, but it's coming. So I hope this was helpful. Leave a comment, like and subscribe. And I've just kind of sort of figured out, if most of the people who watch my videos like the videos, that helps the YouTube. If you want other people to find my videos, just hit the like button with a degree of regularity, and that will help other people find my videos. So, but whether or not other people should find my videos, I'm still conflicted. And you can see my conversation with Brett and Cale on that. So thanks for watching.